Clint Smith, you've been awarded so many different honors as a poet, as an author, a New York Times bestseller, NAACP Image Award finalist, and a consistently praised staff writer at The Atlantic. I have to start with asking, where did your passion for writing come from?
Yes, I've loved writing since I was a kid. I had a little notebook where I would write sort of doodles and poems. And I remember one of the first poems I ever wrote was in third grade, and my teacher, the poem was about write about a color, and it went, I hate the color gray. It reminds me of a rainy day. Gray, I really hate that color. It's annoying like my little brother. And my teacher in third grade came over and put her hand on my shoulder and looked over, and she was like, "Clint, that's a beautiful poem. You could be a writer one day." And for all I know, she could have gone and told every single kid in the classroom the exact same thing. But I remember that moment. There's not a lot that I remember from that period of time in my life, but I remember her saying that. And it is difficult for me to disentangle the fact that I get to make a life as a writer now from having a teacher who just in one statement made it clear that it was a possibility. All I wanted to be was a professional soccer player, really, from age 5 to 17. But there was a spark that had been placed, or that it had been sort of very subtly ignited. And I think, it wasn't until my adult life in 2019, which was between my sophomore and junior year of college, I went to a place called the Nuyorican Poets Cafe in New York City, Lower East Side of Manhattan. And it's one of the most legendary poetry cafes in the country. And my homegirl, who I had an internship alongside, was like, "Hey, let's go to the Nuyorican Poets Cafe." And I was like, "The what? Nah, let's go see Mission Impossible 3. Let's go check out the new Tom Cruise movie." She was like, "Boo, sure. You're whack. Come with me." And so we went. And at this point, I was like a disillusioned English major who was kind of struggling to connect with Keats and Yeats and Frost and Whitman and all these cats on the Western canon. And I went into this room and had just never experienced poetry in the way that I experienced that night, right? This room full of Black and brown and queer people, and people who were doing poems that were so clearly, it was dynamic. The poems lived in their bodies. And they spoke to the world that I saw around me today. And I left that night being like, I don't know what this is, but I want to do it. And so I went back to Davidson, where Steph Curry was my classmate. And I was like, I'm going to start a poetry group. And so we started a poetry group and did our sort of cosplaying of Dead Poets Society. And on Sundays, we got together in one of the academic rooms and shared poems and wrote poems. And I've been taking it seriously, sort of writing as a craft since then. But even then had no idea that of the trajectory that my life would put me on. But I'm grateful to be here.
No, I mean, it's crazy. Just little words of encouragement, whether it's a teacher or a coach, a mentor, can speak over you, that can really kind of change, how your life is going to go.
Absolutely.
In that same vein, I wanted to know, who are your literary heroes? And I'm not going to ask you to pick one, because that's always hard to narrow down one. But I'll say, between poets and authors, who is your starting 5? And just a little bit maybe why.
Oh, man.
Or maybe you don't get 3 or 4, whatever it may be. But
no, it's a great question. And one, it's always hard to do these things on the spot because you always forget folks. I mean, I can give you some names of people who, some old heads, or some people from sort of the canon, and then more contemporary folks. It's a mix. I mean, obviously Toni Morrison. I think I had the opportunity to see Toni Morrison in person when I was at Harvard getting my PhD, and she was giving a series of lectures. And I had this moment, it's like when you see someone in person and you're like, it is remarkable that I'm actually alive on Earth at the same time as this person, right? And much less in the same room. I think there are very few people. It's like Toni Morrison, I felt that way. I think the fact that I was alive at the same time as Nelson Mandela, that's bananas to me. I never obviously was in the same room, but John Lewis is a similar person. I was like, that he was around just until a year or two ago, despite his legendary status. But I feel that way about Toni Morrison, and her work sort of shimmers in everything that I do. And I think she laid the groundwork, both literally and in a literary context, for so many Black writers who would come after her. I would say Baldwin, just because he is among the best essayists that's ever lived. He just spoke so poignantly and so precisely to so much of the way that America failed to see itself for who it really was. And I think just again is someone who, an early iteration of someone who laid the groundwork for what has been possible for us. I think in a more contemporary sense, the folks like Elizabeth Alexander, who was our inaugural poet for Obama's first term, but is now the president of the Mellon Foundation, but was department chair of African American Studies at Yale, wrote an incredible memoir, in addition to being a really prolific poet. And I have the pleasure of knowing her personally, and she's just like a very kind, warm person. And then you got folks like, I'm gonna just start naming other people like Jhumpa Lahiri, who I think is like one of the best novelists working today. Mohsin Hamid, who wrote a book called Exit West. Really, those two writers specifically, I think, write about the nature of immigration and the immigrant experience in ways that I find so powerful. So you got folks like Toni Morrison and James Baldwin and Elizabeth Alexander, who, as Black writers who have lived at different points in time, create work that serves as almost a mirror into like me being able to see myself in their work and understand who I am as a Black person more clearly. And then you have folks like Jhumpa Lahiri or Mohsin Hamid, who almost serve as a window, right? Because I think that's what literature can do. It can serve as both a mirror or a window, and a window into a set of experiences that are very different from my own. I don't know what it's like to be an Indian American person, or a first generation Indian immigrant, or a first generation Bengali immigrant, or somebody who is a refugee and who has been displaced because of war or natural disasters. But those two writers write so beautifully about those subjects. And I've recently been revisiting their work, and so they're top of mind. So not necessarily a starting five, but those are five writers who I've been thinking about lately.
It's so funny, when I first started doing these, or was envisioning doing these conversations, I had a list of people, and Toni Morrison was one of like the main people. I was like, I know the chances of me actually getting a chance to sit down and talk with her are slim to none, but like, I would love to, just talk with her. And it's been so interesting to hear how many people have either quoted her, referenced her as an influence, throughout time, throughout different, industries, points of life. And I think that's really just a testament to who she was, but also what her work revealed about our society, about us, about how we interpret life. I thought that was really powerful.
A quote from her is the first, the opening of my book. It's the first line or the first quote that you see before the epilogue. And it's because, again, literally, she created the space for me to be able to write a book like this. I have a book right here. It says, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use. But in fact, it is not flooding. It is remembering where it used to be. So it's a book about, the book is largely about how we remember or misremember the history of slavery. And so I think, this idea, this metaphor of the way that a river always finds its way back to where it originally came from felt poignant. But I mean, like, Toni Morrison just has bars, like every, just like
Facts.
every book is just bars everywhere. So it could have been a million quotes I could have put in the front of this book from her.
Sure. I want to get to your new book, but I want to first go back to your first book, Counting Descent. Which was a book about poems. This new book is nonfiction. So I'm curious to know the differences in the writing process for you between writing a book like this and writing a book of poems.
Yeah. So, like I said, sort of at the beginning, poetry is how I came into writing. It is in some ways, feels the most natural. Because what I like about poems is that poems allow you to wrestle with a set of questions without having to necessarily come to an answer or come to a conclusion. And the poem is both the creation of a piece of art itself, but also like a mechanism through which I do my best thinking. And so a lot of times I'll write poems to think through a question or an idea, or to focus and reflect on something. And what I like about poetry is that it forces you to pay attention in different ways than you otherwise might not. So even if, there's a tree outside my yard, and it's a tree that I probably walk past, I walk past every day, multiple times a day. But what a poem does is it says, let's pick a leaf on that tree and like focus in the most minute, granular way on what that leaf looks like. And you'll see that it's actually 5 different shades of green, or that there's like a slight ember of yellow at the tip, or the way that the stem sort of looks like spider webs itself through the leaf, or the shape of the leaf and how it resembles a star, or whatever the case may be. What a poem does is says, let me focus on this thing to excavate the sort of nature of what it is. And part of I think I brought a lot of that into the narrative nonfiction book, right? Which is about how I go to different historical sites throughout the country and explore how they reckon with or fail to reckon with their respective relationships to the history of slavery. And so it's one thing to read about a slave cabin, and it's another thing to physically be inside of one, and to hear the way that the wood moans under your feet when you step inside, to see the way that there are slivers of sunlight that slide in through the cracks in the wood, and to consider that, how susceptible to the elements the enslaved people who lived in that cabin would have been. And so for a book like that, part of what I'm trying to do is not only make it a history book, but also make it a book that brings in those sensory details and brings in that human texture and that emotional texture. It makes the reader feel like they're there. And I wouldn't have been able to write a book like that had I not been sort of trained as a poet first, because it again trains you to think about the most minute sights and sounds, and to really engage with the sort of sensory experience of a thing or a place or a memory in ways that bring it to sort of full 3-dimensional life.
No doubt, no doubt. I mean, your new book is titled How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. And I'm super excited to dive into the book. Can't wait to read it. But I think the words that you use at the beginning, reckoning with, are so powerful, because in this country, or even if we choose to reckon with our past, is a constant debate. What are your thoughts on if people don't reckon with the history of slavery and its aftermath in this country?
I mean, I think part of what happens if we don't reckon with it, and we don't realize not only our physical proximity to it in terms of the landscape that we all occupy, but also our temporal proximity to it, right? Like, part of what we have to remember is that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago wasn't actually that long ago at all. Slavery existed in this country for about 250 years and has only not existed for 150. So you have this institution that existed almost 100 years longer than it didn't. You have the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016, who rang the bell to sort of signal the opening of this Smithsonian Museum, who was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter, but the daughter in 2016 of someone who had been born into intergenerational chattel slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when my 4-year-old son sits on my grandfather's lap, I think of my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm again reminded that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago wasn't actually that long ago at all. And when you realize our proximity to this period of time, you realize how deeply and profoundly it has shaped our contemporary political, social, and economic infrastructure. And that the idea that that institution that in the scope of human history only existed like yesterday, the idea that someone would suggest that that has nothing to do with what the contemporary landscape of inequality looks like is both morally and intellectually disingenuous. It has profoundly shaped what our landscape looks like. And so a failure to understand how close we are to it allows you to fall into the trap of thinking that it has nothing to do with the world we live in today. I remember in elementary school, I learned about slavery like it was something that happened in the Jurassic period, right? Like it was the Flintstones, the dinosaurs, and slavery, like they all existed at the same time. But again, it is so recent. There are people who are alive today who loved, who were raised by, who were in community with, people who were born into bondage. And we have to take that seriously. And part of what going to all these different historical sites did for me was make clear how close and intimate this history is.
Mm. Shifting gears a little bit, critical race theory is under attack. Every single day you read a headline about a new school district or politician or school board fighting against it, fighting against information, fighting against facts. At the same time, Congress just passed the vote that makes Juneteenth a national holiday. How do we ensure our children are properly educated?
I mean, it's not a coincidence that there is an intentional effort to push back against what these folks are calling critical race theory. I mean, the thing that we should also name is that they're saying they're using critical race theory as like a boogeyman, and this sort of all-encompassing term, whether it's critical race theory, the 1619 Project, to talk about history they don't like, and to talk about history that calls into question the story America has long told about itself. And so part of what's happened is that over the past year, really over the past several years, but it's been sort of supercharged over the past year, more people have developed an understanding of the history and the sociology and the language and the framework and the toolkit with which to more effectively make sense of and understand how the contemporary landscape of inequality has come to exist, and to understand racism as not something that's just an interpersonal phenomenon, but it is a historical one and a systemic one, and one that has been shaped by decades of policy decisions. And so, the idea that we have Juneteenth happening, becoming a federal holiday, while at the same time having so many of these states create state-sanctioned efforts to prevent teachers from teaching the very context from which Juneteenth emerges, is reflective of the marathon of cognitive dissonance that it is to be a Black person in this country, right? Where, it is very clear, and we should take seriously, that Juneteenth in and of itself is not enough, right? I know there's some people who are like, I don't want a holiday, I want reparations, or I want reform, I want abolition, and I think that is something to be taken seriously, because symbolic victories, there are limitations to them. But we also shouldn't take for granted the role that symbols can play, right? So I think all the time about how part of what the origin story of my book is that I was watching these Confederate monuments come down in my home state or my hometown in New Orleans in 2017. Statue of Robert E. Lee, P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis. And I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. What did it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Highway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street named after somebody who owned 150 enslaved people. Because the thing about symbols and monuments and holidays and all of this is that they're not just symbols. They are reflective of stories that we tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. So it's not to say that taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee or making Juneteenth a holiday is going to erase the racial wealth gap. Of course not. But part of what it is, all these things are part of an ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that can help us recalibrate our understanding of history and recalibrate our understanding of why certain communities look the way that they do, and to understand that as being a reflection not of the people in those communities, but what has been done to these communities generation after generation after generation. And so it is important that Juneteenth has become a national holiday, and there's also so much more to do. Critical race theory, they are attempting to prevent us from confronting and honestly reckoning with history, because they know that the more young people learn about this country's history, the less this country is able to lie to them anymore. And that is an existential threat to how many people in this country understand themselves in relation to this country.
Mm. You talked earlier about the importance of going and placing your physical feet in these locations. You know, it's one thing, like you said, to read about slavery. It's another thing to actually be in a, slave cabin. In your book, you made a point to go to a lot of these places: Monticello, Angola, Goree Island, the Whitney Plantation. I haven't made it to West Africa yet, but it's on my list to go. Because you're so good with words, can you articulate what it felt like to stand in some of these places?
So I'll describe one place. Is Angola. Angola is a prison in Louisiana. It is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It is a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it is built on top of a former plantation. And what I tell folks is that if you were to go to Germany and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was built on top of a former concentration camp in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist, because it would so clearly run counter to all of our moral and ethical sensibilities. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, where the vast majority of people held there are Black men serving life sentences, many of whom were sentenced as children, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which has since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States, who go out into fields of what was once a plantation and pick crops from that field while someone watches over them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder. And so when I'm standing in the fields of Angola, when I'm standing in the prison, in the cages at this place, part of what I'm thinking about are what are the ways that a history of white supremacy not only enacts physical violence against people's bodies, but also collectively numbs us to certain types of violences that in another global context would be wildly unacceptable. And what does it mean that that place not only is not willing to confront and tell an honest story about its history and its relationship to slavery, but that it has a gift shop. And in that gift shop, it sells shot glasses and coffee mugs and baseball caps and stuffed animals and sweatshirts. And on one of the coffee mugs, it has a silhouette of a watchtower. And above and below the silhouette, it says Angola, a gated community. So not only is this place not being honest about its history, it is ostensibly making a mockery of and belittling the experiences of millions of thousands of people who continue to live on that land. And so, I've worked in prisons for 7 years now, in jails and prisons in Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. But nothing could prepare me for what I encountered in that place. I could have written a whole book about just Angola. And I think when you're there, the sort of the stakes feel much higher, because you see these people who, most of whom are going to die in this prison, where the average sentence is, are more than 80 years of their lives. And it just is a profoundly haunting and deeply unsettling place. And that sense of hauntingness is just amplified and magnified when you're there for yourself.
I'm sure you learn so much visiting these places, kind of going through this process. And I'm sure there's so many stories like Angola that you can tell that really change your perspective. But I'm wondering throughout this process, was there anything you learned about yourself that came out in this research?
I think I was surprised by my capacity to be surprised, right? Like, I think I went into this book thinking like, okay, I get it. Like, I've read books on slavery. Like, I understand. I want to learn more, but I didn't think I would find myself viscerally shocked. But I felt that way when I was at Angola. I felt that way when I was at the Whitney Plantation, standing in what they call the Field of Angels, which is a memorial to thousands of enslaved children who died as when they were children in Louisiana. And there was a moment where I had a not even 2-year-old son and another child on the way, and it just felt the idea of being separated from my children, the idea of losing one of my children, something a parent always fears, but I think that was part of the everyday experience of what it meant to be enslaved in ways that I hadn't fully accounted for. And so I think it's just that's an example and is reflective of the way the sort of intimacy of these places, the way these places make you feel something and experience something that you might know intellectually or know in the abstract, but like being there and like seeing a statue of an angel holding the body of a dead child, being at Angola and walking through death row, or seeing men work in fields of what was once a plantation, being at Blandford Cemetery, one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country, where the remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And I went during the Sons Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration, and being in a place where hundreds of people were there to celebrate an army that was predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery, an army that would have had my ancestors enslaved in perpetuity. At each place, the stakes and the intimacy of that history, I felt it in my body. And I think when you feel it in your body, when the history is like pulsing through your veins, your sense of what it means, it changes. And I think I have a lot more clarity than I did 4 years ago when I started this project. And I also think that I can never look at this country in the same way, because I have a more acute understanding of what it has done.
Clint, I just want to thank you for taking the time today. I want to congratulate you on your book, being #1 on New York Times bestsellers list. We go into these deep topics, and it can be weighty. So I always want to finish on more of a lighter note, and that is, what is currently bringing you joy in your life?
What is currently bringing me joy?
Doesn't have to be deep, can be superficial, or it can be.
Some of my friends, after I got #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, sent me a whole lot of Hot Pockets.
Okay.
They are always like making fun of my culinary tastes, and they're like, Clint can't cook, and I love Hot Pockets, and I was like living off Hot Pockets in college. It was basically like Hot Pockets and quesadillas.
For sure.
But I hadn't had one in a while, because my wife is like, nah, you're not about to bring that mess into my house. But they sent me these Hot Pockets, and so I had a Hot Pocket for the first time in like 2 years. And then I gave my 4-year-old a bite. I gave my 2-year-old a bite, and I saw their eyes being like, "What is this magic thing you were putting on? It's like a pizza, but it's like you can't see it was like a whole." And so to share that moment with them, where I have passed down my love of Hot Pockets to my children, probably much to my wife's chagrin. That was it. And it's just those small moments with my kids. Having small kids can be exhausting, but like, there's just so much wonder. Like, everything is like, whoa, a pizza, it wrapped inside of itself. They're just like, it's amazing. And I think
For sure,
it just makes everything new. When they experience something for the first time, it's like you're experiencing it for the first time.
No, that is dope. Last thing for you, Clint, if people want to follow you, follow your work, where's the best way they can find you?
I'm at Clint Smith III, Clint Smith III, everywhere, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. That's also my website, clintsmithii.com. Yeah, and I hope you follow along.
Appreciate the time, man, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you for having me.